It was May 5, 1993, a humid Wednesday evening in West Memphis, Arkansas. The kind of night that felt heavy and unremarkable, the kind where families gathered on porches, and children played until the street lights flickered on. In a small neighborhood called Robin Hood Hills, 3 8-year-old boys, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore and Christopher Byers, left home to ride their bikes just as they always did. They promised to be home before dark. But that night they never returned. When the sun dipped beneath the horizon and the crickets began to sing, the boys' parents realized something was wrong. West Memphis was small, too small for children to simply vanish. Within hours, the quiet suburban air thickened with dread. As night turned to dawn, a massive search began. Police officers, volunteers, and local parents fanned out through the woods and ditches of Robin Hood Hills, a patch of forest wedged between an interstate, truck stop, and drainage canal. For 24 hours, flashlights cut through the trees, voices called out the boys' names, and fear began to replace hope. Then the following day, May 6th, one officer spotted something glinting in a muddy ditch. A small boy's sneaker, floating, caught in the reeds. What they found next would change West Memphis forever. Inside that shallow, murky creek, searchers discovered the bodies of Stevie, Michael, and Christopher. They were found naked, submerged beneath water, their bicycles tangled nearby. The scene was eerie, chaotic. A terrible silence had settled over the woods. The community, unprepared for such horror, would never be the same again. In a town already fragile with gossip and fear, whispers began spreading like wildfire. People spoke of evil, of the devil, of ritual sacrifice. The Robin Hood Hills murders, as they came to be known, would become one of the most infamous and controversial cases in American criminal history. And at the center of it all, 3 teenage boys from the same town, whose lives would be forever changed by suspicion, panic, and injustice. Before we dive into this haunting story of murder, hysteria, and the search for truth, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more real-life mysteries, more cold cases, and more stories that deserve to be remembered. Hit like, subscribe, and stay till the end, because the truth behind the West Memphis Three is darker and more tragic than anyone could have imagined. The investigation began immediately. Police sealed off the wooded area and began collecting evidence. But from the very beginning, mistakes were made. Officers waded into the creek without protective gear, contaminating potential footprints, fibers, and biological evidence. They drained the ditch hastily, desperate to find clues. But in their urgency, they destroyed the scene before forensics could make sense of it. The autopsies, conducted soon after, revealed the boys had likely been killed sometime the previous evening. Their injuries, though heavily debated, appeared brutal and disturbing. Rumors spread almost instantly. The boys were victims of satanic ritual. It was the 1990s, the height of the satanic panic, a nationwide fear that cults were secretly operating in small towns targeting children. Daytime talk shows, news broadcasts, and police briefings fanned the flames of hysteria. In a deeply religious area like West Memphis, the idea of a satanic cult struck raw terror. Police were under immense pressure. 3 children were dead, the town demanded justice, and the press demanded answers. With little hard evidence, investigators began focusing on the town's misfits, teenagers who dressed in black, listened to heavy metal, and didn't quite fit the mold. One name surfaced almost immediately: Damien Echols. Damien was 18 years old, pale, soft-spoken, deeply interested in spirituality and the occult. He wore black trench coats in summer, read Stephen King, and wrote in journals about philosophy and magic. In a conservative southern town, that was enough to draw suspicion. To police he looked the part. To the media he fit the story. Soon, his best friend Jason Baldwin, age 16, and an acquaintance Jessie Misskelley Jr, age 17, were also brought into the spotlight. Jessie was quiet, developmentally delayed, and had a low IQ, something police would later exploit. The investigation quickly turned into a manhunt for evil, not for evidence. Detectives interrogated Jessie Misskelley for hours. Unrecorded sessions, leading questions, pressure tactics, all without a lawyer or parent present. After hours of confusion and fatigue, Jessie gave a statement. He said Damien and Jason had killed the 3 boys during a satanic ritual. That confession, though full of inconsistencies, would become the cornerstone of the case. Jessie's timeline didn't match. His description of the crime scene was riddled with errors. But it didn't matter, police had their suspects. The town sighed in relief. The evil had been caught. But what followed would shock the world: the trial, the evidence, and the deep fractures in America's criminal justice system. Because this case wasn't about proof. It was about panic, prejudice, and the desperate need for someone to blame. And so began the story of the West Memphis Three, three teenagers who would spend nearly 2 decades behind bars for crimes they may have never committed. To this day, the question lingers: did justice prevail, or did fear decide their fate? West Memphis, Arkansas, the summer of 1993. Within weeks of the discovery, the police department had its narrative. Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley, the so-called satanic trio, had sacrificed 3 children in a ritual killing. The arrests came fast. The evidence? Thin. The public outrage? Massive. By the time the teenagers were formally charged, the story had already spread nationwide. Newspapers called it a glimpse into the devil's work. Television reporters camped outside the courthouse. The fear was tangible. The idea that satanic worshippers had infiltrated an American neighborhood was too sensational to resist. But when you stripped away the headlines, all that was left were holes. Gaping, unexplainable holes. The police had no physical evidence linking the 3 teens to the crime scene. No fingerprints. No blood. No DNA. The only thing they had was Jessie Misskelley's confession. But that confession was a house of cards. Jessie was interrogated for nearly 12 hours, yet only 46 minutes were recorded. During questioning, he repeatedly contradicted himself. He got times wrong, places wrong, even the sequence of events. When officers told him his version didn't match the evidence, they corrected him, guiding him toward the narrative they wanted. Jessie, desperate to please authority figures, repeated back their words. And that became the official confession. In any normal investigation, such inconsistencies would have unraveled the case. But this wasn't a normal investigation. This was a town possessed by fear. And fear doesn't need proof. It just needs a face. The trials began in 1994. They were held separately, Jessie's first, then Damien and Jason together. The prosecution's case leaned heavily on 3 pillars: Jessie's confession, occult expert testimony, and the boy's appearance. Damien's black clothes, his journal writings, his interest in Wicca, all painted as evidence of evil. A local so-called occult specialist was brought in to testify that the number of wounds on the victims suggested ritualistic significance, a claim later debunked by real forensic scientists. Even the defense attorneys were outmatched. The state's case was theatrical: crosses, charts, dramatic photographs. The defense had almost nothing. The courtroom atmosphere was a modern-day witch trial. Damien, at just 18, sat stone-faced, trying to appear calm. The cameras loved him. He was intelligent, articulate, and unafraid to speak. To many, that made him dangerous. Jason Baldwin, quiet and studious, seemed lost amid the chaos. Jessie, barely understanding what was happening, looked terrified. When the verdict came, it felt like a funeral. Jessie Misskelley was sentenced to life plus 40 years. Jason Baldwin, life without parole. And Damien Echols, death by lethal injection. 3 boys convicted on fear, not fact. Outside the courthouse, the crowd cheered. Justice for the children, they said. But for those who looked deeper, the real victims had just multiplied. As the years passed, time began to reveal the cracks. Reporters, filmmakers, and activists started re-examining the case. In 1996, HBO released the documentary Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills. The film changed everything. Viewers across America were stunned. They saw, for the first time, the inconsistencies, the coerced confession, the lack of evidence. They saw teenagers railroaded by panic. Soon, the West Memphis Three became a cause, a rallying cry against wrongful convictions. Celebrities, lawyers, and investigators joined the fight. Names like Eddie Vedder, Johnny Depp, and Peter Jackson poured funds into re-examining the evidence. And as DNA technology advanced, so did the truth. In 2007, new DNA tests were conducted on material from the crime scene: hair, fibers, biological residue. None of it matched Damien, Jason, or Jessie. Not one piece. Instead, a hair found on one of the bindings was consistent with Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of one of the victims, Christopher Byers. Though not definitive, the revelation reignited questions about what really happened in those woods. How could the police have missed that? Why were other suspects ignored? Terry Hobbs, through lawyers, denied any involvement, and to this day, no formal charges were brought against him. By 2010, Damien Echols had spent 18 years on death row. Jason and Jessie nearly 2 decades behind bars. Public support had swelled, and so had the evidence that something was terribly wrong. Then, in 2011, an unexpected deal changed everything. the Alford plea. Under this rare legal arrangement, the three men were allowed to plead guilty while still maintaining their innocence, acknowledging that the state had enough evidence to convict them, but not admitting to the crime itself. It was a legal loophole, a compromise between justice and mercy. In August 2011, the West Memphis Three walked free. After 18 years. After losing their youth, their futures, and nearly their lives, they stepped out into the daylight, no longer inmates, but never truly free. They were free men but still convicted felons. Their names forever tied to one of the most polarizing murder cases in American history. And so the question lingers, echoing through the years. If the real killer was never found, then who killed Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers? Was it truly a satanic ritual? Was it an act of rage hidden beneath small-town politics? Or was it something else entirely, something the world may never know? Justice is supposed to be blind. But in West Memphis it wasn't. It looked through fear. It saw difference as guilt. And three young men paid the price. If you believe stories like this matter, if you believe truth deserves a voice, subscribe and stay curious. Because the case of the West Memphis Three isn't just about what happened in 1993. It's about what can happen anywhere when justice forgets to look past its own reflection. 18 years. That's how long it took for Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley to see the world again. Not through prison bars but through sunlight. But freedom isn't the same thing as peace. The day they walked out of the Craighead County Courthouse in August of 2011, the air outside was thick with reporters, cameras, and flashing lights. They were older now, faces sharper, eyes heavier. Damien, dressed in black as always, smiled faintly. But that smile wasn't triumph. It was disbelief. "I've been in hell for 18 years, he told the cameras, and I'm still adjusting to breathing. Jason Baldwin stood beside him, quieter, composed, the same loyalty that kept him from accepting an earlier plea deal years before. He refused to admit guilt until Damien's life was safe. That was the kind of bond forged in the fire of injustice. And Jessie, shy, nervous, still struggling with words, just wanted to go home. The Alford plea gave them freedom, but not exoneration. Their convictions remain on record. The state of Arkansas avoided a formal apology, avoided responsibility. The message was clear: we'll let you go, but we'll never admit we were wrong. 4 years after their release, the three men tried to rebuild lives that no longer felt like their own. Damien moved to New York, finding solace in art and writing. His memoir, Life After Death, detailed the psychological wounds of solitary confinement, the sleepless nights, the sensory deprivation, the nightmares that never ended. Jason, humble and private, dedicated himself to legal advocacy, fighting for others still trapped in the system. Jessie retreated into quiet living, working modest jobs, still haunted by the role his coerced confession played in the nightmare that followed. Meanwhile, the questions never stopped. Who really killed those 3 children in Robin Hood Hills? Over the years, attention turned again to Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of one of the victims. Witnesses came forward claiming they saw him with the boys that night. DNA evidence placed a hair consistent with his profile on one of the bindings. Yet still, no charges. The state insisted there was insufficient evidence to reopen the case. And then there's the other suspect, John Mark Byers, the stepfather of another victim. He was erratic, grieving, and in the early documentaries he came across as volatile. 4 years he was suspected by viewers, especially after inconsistencies in his statements. But later DNA cleared him. He publicly apologized to Damien, Jason, and Jessie. In a haunting twist, Byers himself died in 2020, still insisting he'd never stop seeking the truth for his son. 3 decades have passed since that night in May 1993. The woods of Robin Hood Hills are quiet now. The creek still runs, the trees still sway with the same Arkansas wind. But the story lingers, like a ghost that refuses to rest. When you walk through those woods today, you can still find the remnants, the faint traces of where police tape once hung, where candles once burned, where cameras once rolled. It's a reminder that a story doesn't end when the verdict is read. Sometimes that's where it begins. The case of the West Memphis Three has become more than a crime story. It's a mirror, one reflecting our fear, our biases, our hunger for closure, even if it costs innocence. And maybe that's the real tragedy here. Not just the murder of 3 boys in 1993, but the murder of truth that followed. There are still files sealed away. Still witnesses who never spoke. Still pieces of evidence lost, mislabeled, or destroyed. And there's still a question echoing across time. If the real killer was never found, then where is he now? Pause. Does he walk among the crowd, free and unseen? Or did the answers vanish with the passing years? buried beneath fear, silence, and the failure of justice? The West Memphis Three may be free, but justice? Justice is still missing. This is more than a story, it's a warning. Because when fear takes the place of fact, when hysteria replaces truth, anyone can become the villain. If you made it this far, thank you for staying curious. Like this video, subscribe for more true crime documentaries, and help stories like this one stay alive, because some cases are too cold to stay buried.